What's going on? What's going on? What's going on, everybody? My name's Mazi Mutafa, Executive Director of Words, Beats, and Life. And this is day 4 of the alternative winter break. This is the second year we're doing this. And it's all about the media arts, people that are publishing, podcasting, in media of various different kinds. And so I'm super excited to bring you all Katia Stitt, who is one of my managers at WPFW, a place that I volunteer. Lots of people in volunteers business don't like to be called managers, but that's what she is. What's going on, Katia?
Hey, Mazi, it's great to see you and great to see the young people.
No doubt. Thank you so much for taking time to join us.
Of course.
As you know, this is an alternative winter break, and the whole idea is to share different maps to the same destinations.
Right.
And so with that, I love to begin these conversations by asking really simple questions about things like yourself and your family. So who are the ancestors that you can't I always struggle with this question. The oldest ancestors you are aware of?
Okay, so I would say on my mother's side, I know of my great grandfather who was a Pentecostal preacher, and my grandmother. My great grandmother, who was a domestic servant, but by the time I met her, she was retired, and she just took care of us, when we were visiting. She lived with my grandmother. And then on my father's side, and I have 2 fathers. So my father, Sonny Stitt, I know of my great grandfather. I never met him, but he was in Martinique. My grandmother on Sonny's side, Sonny Stitt's side, is from Martinique, and she immigrated when she was 6 years old. So I know of her father. And then on my biological father's side, Carlton Vesey is Reverend Carlton Vesey is my biological father. I know of my grandfather and grandmother on his side, and they were from Memphis, from Mississippi, then Memphis, then finally, he made it to DC.
You really
so lots of family.
You're kind of from all over the place.
Yes, indeed.
How do you think actually having, the knowledge of this many elders and ancestors from all over impacts the way you think about this idea of like where you're from or who you're from?
Well, it's interesting. I definitely think that in terms of my person, I am rooted in the Black experience, very specifically Black American experience, but like really centering that. But then I also think of myself as a global citizen. And the interesting thing is, I have always thought of myself in those terms. As a young person, when I was in my 20s, I managed bands for a living and tour managed and traveled all sorts of places all over Europe. I went to Pakistan, I went to Morocco and Turkey. And very early on, I just felt like I belong as a global citizen. I remember my grandmother on Sonny's side. So they emigrated to Boston, and then her first husband, they moved to Saginaw, Michigan. And when she would get angry with us, we'd come up and visit her in the summers. And when she would get angry, she would speak patois. And I remember only my father understood her. And I remember asking my father, like, what is this about? And that's when he told me. So I feel like, they say things are in divine order. Even before I knew of all of these tentacles all over, I always felt a little bit like I was a global citizen, but centered and steeped in the African experience in America.
Speaking of divine order, because one of the things I love to do is like build a timeline of someone's life. And we started off with your ancestors. You already jumped to your 20s. Let's go back.
Yeah.
Let's go back to what do you remember as your earliest creative memory? And creative is an expansive word. So thinking about whether that's a kind of art or just your imagination, but what's your earliest creative memory?
I was 5 years old, 4 or 5 in kindergarten, and painting. And I still have those pictures, and they're even framed because my mother framed them and put them on the wall. And then when I get a little older, when I get to like 12, 13, I start going through their albums and picking up on folks like, and I don't even know, I guess I'm an old soul, but picking up on folks like Gloria Lynn and Dinah Washington and singing along, and Dionne Warwick and Burt Bacharach, because my mother loved them, and singing along. So I would say painting at a very young age, and then following that would be singing.
It's interesting because one of the things about being a young person is that you, whether you like it or not, unfortunately in your case you liked it, your parents' tastes impact you a lot. And so you talked about some of the, like a couple things. One, the fact that your mother framed your kindergarten paintings and that you still have them says a lot about the kind of support you likely received at home in terms of people encouraging you to pursue creativity, or to just at least not put it to the side, but just make it a part of who it is that you are. And so then you talk about being a little older and singing and maybe sorting through some records like these. Were your parents creative at all?
Yeah, they were actually. So my father, for maybe those that don't know, the father that raised me and the father that I really knew of until about 8 years ago, he was a jazz musician, a wonderful musician. His name was Sonny Stitt. He was a saxophonist, composer, band leader. And my mother met my father opening for him under the name of Pat Gilbert. That was her stage name. And she met him at the Howard Theater, opening for him. He was there for a week's engagement, and she opened for him. And it happened twice in a year's span. So he came twice for a week, and he kind of met her and saw her, the first time, and they exchanged pleasantries. And then the next time he actually took her out on a date. And you got to remember, this is like the 50s, right? Late 50s. So it's not like courting now. I don't even know if the young people call it courting, dating, Netflix and chill. I don't know what they call it. You know what I mean? But because he was really a famous jazz musician and his career was well underway, he couldn't court her the way a normal person would that lived in the city. So the second time he came, they went out on a date while he was here. And again, she's singing. She was a singer. She's opening for him. And towards the end of the week, he comes to my grandmother's house, and he says, and my great grandmother and my grandmother lived together. And he says to them, listen, Pammy and I really like each other. He probably said dig. We really dig each other. And I can't court her the way a man that lived here would. So she's going to come on the road with me. And as you can imagine, and my mother was singing, but she was also, she had graduated from DC Teachers College, which at that time was part of Howard University. She's a Delta. She was dating a pre-med student. So, she was on one trajectory, and then hooking up with my father was all of a sudden another trajectory. And at that time, being a musician, particularly a jazz musician, was really frowned upon. This was not, all they thought of was like drugs and alcohol and, all the things that we know should not be associated with musicians, but at that time were. And so she left with him. When he left, she left a few days later. Mm-hmm. And then they got, eventually they got married, and the rest is kind of history.
And so they get married. Does he stay on the road, or does he settle down?
They were on the road for a minute. So they get married the first time in Saginaw, Michigan, where his mother was, and they have a kind of just as a piece small wedding. And then they come back and they get married in DC at Zion Baptist Church, and that is actually in Jet magazine. Back then when people of note got anything, they put it in Jet magazine. So there's actually a picture of them cutting the cake in Jet magazine. And they lived for a while. I'm in New York right now visiting my daughter, and they lived right here in New York on West End Avenue, like 89th or 90th and West End. And he was playing, and she was a housewife at that time. We were not born yet. And one of her best friends was Frances, Miles Davis's first wife, and they would hang out a lot. And they would, go the whole club scene, everything. And then finally they moved to DC. And my mother was a school teacher. She had studied to be a school teacher, and she actually became a school teacher. And they moved back to DC at the point where, they wanted to have children. They wanted to be closer to my mother's family, that kind of thing.
And so how do you think having a mother that was a teacher and a father that was a musician shaped your childhood, if at all?
Well, my mother, to this day, right, when I speak in the vernacular or use slang, as we say, I hear my mother's voice, like, because she was a teacher, and she was education was really important to her. And being able to, what we call now, code switch was really important to her. She did feel like children in their own environments, and adults too, should be able to speak however they want. But she also understood that because we live in a white, mostly white patriarchal society, that being able to communicate in the ways that they understand is also important. So she was really deaf on me about that, and studying. But she also had, she wouldn't have called herself an activist, but she really was at that time. She taught in DC, at what was then Meyer Elementary School, which was right across the street from Cardozo High School. And she would really make sure that the children that were in her classes had what they need, and if they needed extra tutoring, if they needed notebooks, if they needed clothing, whatever they need, she made sure they had so that they can matriculate effectively. She was, so I think in that way, I think that's definitely part of what I have in terms of wanting to help people. And then with my father, he was more whimsical, right? He got to do, and my mother, by the way, did not want to come off the road. She stopped singing because my father was like, look, one of us has to be home with these children. And my career is more established. And, frankly, again, the patriarchy comes in, right? Because he's a man. So he's still on the road, and he stayed on the road until he passed. So my mother said, okay, I'll be a teacher and I'll be here with the children. So I think from my father, I get that kind of wanderlust. Like, I love the road. I still do road management for Sweet Honey on the Rock, and I've done it for a number of bands. And I love being on the road. There's nothing like it, frankly. And I know I get that from my father. But I also think with both of them, the expansiveness, even though she was a teacher, she loved music, right? She loved art. She would take us to musicals when we were very young. She'd take us to plays. She would read to us and encourage us to read things. And then my father, he just loved all sorts of music. And so he had, they both had all sorts of music playing. And I'm sure that is a reason that I'm not steeped in one musical tradition, but in many.
And so thinking about your mother as not just a teacher, but as a singer, I'm curious, was she the only adult in those kind of formative preteen, teen years that was encouraging your creativity?
Well, my father, I think my father encouraged her more than my mother. My mother was really, I'll tell you something funny. When I was in my 20s and, doing pretty well for myself and touring and getting to go to all these places, one time she said to me, "You're just like your father." So I'm not sure. I went to Georgetown University, and they were both very proud of that. But my mother was really like, okay, you're going to quote unquote make something of yourself, right? Because you have this type of education. She didn't see, as much as she was a part of the arts and she loved the arts herself and she loved music herself, she felt like it wasn't practical. Where my father, all he ever did from the time that he was 15 was play music, and he died when I was 18, 17, almost 18, actually. He died before my 18th birthday. So I think they both did. But, our whole family was musical. My aunt and uncle, they sang in the church. I have a cousin who studied opera at Howard University and graduated from there summa cum laude. And he actually was really great. I remember he invited me. They were doing a dress rehearsal for an opera they were doing. Howard was doing at the Kennedy Center. And when I was like 13 years old, he invited me to come and check it out. And so, there was always this through line in our family that music was important, the arts were important, but it wasn't practical for a career.
Did you, other than singing around the house, did you ever pick up singing? Even in school? Was anything outside of the house?
Okay, well, in the car, no. Well, so I played flute growing up. I still have my flute, and I took piano lessons. My father used to say that if you can play piano and play chess, and pool, you can move in any circle. And I took that pretty seriously. So I played piano, I played chess. And I played pool. And I don't know where he got that saying from, just so you know. But I do think it's kind of true. You know what I mean? You can go to pool hall, you go to the opera house, you can do it all. Mm-hmm. But I studied for a little while with Calvin Jones at the University of the District of Columbia in their jazz studies program. And I quickly found out that I was not a performer. But what I also found out through my early work as I was a producer. And I was a producer for, I produced events for Washington Performing Arts Society, for the Smithsonian. I worked for a number of years for an organization called District Curators. And we had a season that ran from September through July every year. And I was their producer. I produced events here in New York. So I found out I was better behind the scenes, than in front of anything, in front of the camera, on the stage, that kind of thing. Because it was funny. I did a what is that called? Recital, right? And I think I sang My Funny Valentine. And I did okay in that song. And then Calvin made me learn my father's solo. There's an album called Sittin' In with Sonny Stitt and Oscar Peterson. And there's a song called, I think it's Smooth Sailing, if I'm not mistaken. But it's been so long ago, but I had to learn his solo and scat it. And I literally hyperventilated during the scat. And that was the end of my career on stage.
What did you study at Georgetown?
International business diplomacy. And because I always knew that I wanted to be, well, at that time, I wanted to be a foreign service officer. And at the time, we used to have these forums where they had people who worked at the State Department in the Foreign Service come to Georgetown and speak to us. And what I quickly realized at that time, and I'm not sure how much it's changed now, but that most of the African-American folks were either clerical or they were junior officers. The senior officers were almost always white and predominantly male. And that, for me, that turned me off a little bit. But, again, that interest in borders beyond ours here, the seed was kind of planted, you know what I mean? So I've always been a person, and even when I was at Georgetown, that understood that if we can connect with someone else's culture, we find that there's much more that we are, or many more ways that we are similar than different. And I've always taken that wherever I am in the world, even places where I didn't speak the language, because of the arts, because of music, I was able to make my way. I mean, I've been in Pakistan and walked through a garden by myself, and I don't, didn't know Urdu or any of the languages spoken there, but I could communicate. And if I got lost, someone would help me. I mean, this is, I think and you do it with Words Beats in Life, and certainly hip hop is that kind of cultural ambassador, right? But I think that when you can meet like-minded people anywhere in the world, and music is a really beautiful shared language that can give us entree into places where otherwise you wouldn't get in.
So curious, you said the seed was planted. Is that related to when you were talking about just having a traveling bug, or was there something about diplomacy that someone planted, or an experience that planted it?
No, I don't even know why. I mean, honestly, I have no idea why I applied to that program, other than my parents were really excited about it when I said I wanted to go to Georgetown. And there must have been, sometimes we do stuff in that is part of our subconscious, and we don't know really where it comes from. And I would say that is that, because I would suspect that I was more interested in languages than actually diplomacy. But at that time, I didn't know there was anything called linguistics. You know what I mean? And so the next best thing would have been this. Plus, I just felt like, oh, how cool it would be to work in another country. I mean, that was really the first thing I thought. So I think from very early on, the seed was planted. And my father, and I know I'm jumping around, but now that I think about it, it brings back memories talking to you. He would bring me a doll from every country that he's ever been to.
And he traveled abroad. I just assumed he was traveling in the US.
Everywhere, yeah. In fact, he was he used to say this, he was very proud of it, but he was one of the first jazz musicians to go behind the Iron Curtain. So before the fall of the Berlin Wall, he had gone there like 7 times, and gone to communist countries as a jazz musician, and certainly he was one of the first. He wasn't the first. I mean, jazz musicians have always been revered and loved. No, he had traveled everywhere. Literally, he had been on every continent, and performing. So he, I think, single-handedly planted that seed, and I picked it up later,
So, out of curiosity, did you do any kind of student activities at Georgetown that prepared you to do the kind of work with musicians and touring and all that good stuff? Or did you just naturally just step out into that world because you would witness what happened with your father?
No, so this is where WPFW comes in. So while I was at Georgetown, I actually so WDCU, which is where Calvin Jones was, where I took this class, right?
Mhm.
Gwen Redding, who was on the air there, I worked at Blues Alley part-time. So I met Gwen, I met Gail Dixon. So they had me while I was at Georgetown, I would volunteer at Duke Ellington School for the Arts. Gail Dixon got me she was a volunteer coordinator. She's like, come on, you're going to give back. You're going to come help. And then Gwen Redding was on WDCU, and she's like, well, why don't you come over here? And then I met Imani Drayton Hill. You might know Bobby Hill, of course. He was our former program director, but his wife was the operations director. She was also a good friend of mine. I don't even know how we met, but she was like, come on over to PFW. So through WPFW is how oh goodness, forgive me, my COVID brain now trying to go back to your initial question. But WPFW is how I got involved in like production and doing these kind of things, because when I came there, Karen Spellman, who is the wife of A.B. Spellman, both of them are part of the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee. They were in the Civil Rights Movement. And but A.B. was the director of one of the programs at the National Endowment for the Arts. And Karen was producing the first DC Jazz Festival. And she needed an assistant. So I volunteered. And that's how I kind of learned the ropes of production, and of course, I mean, good, bad, or indifferent, when she would meet me or anyone would meet me, they'd say, oh, this is Sonny Stitt's daughter. So I'm sure that helped to open doors, or people would think of me and they would assume maybe even that I knew the music. But I'll tell you something, I didn't really know jazz growing up. I mean, I knew my father's music. I knew Miles and Dizzy, but not like knew them. I knew their names, but more
Mhm.
as friends of his than actually the music. It wasn't until PFW that I learned the music.
Mhm.
So, and then once I learned the music, I was able to matriculate as a producer and do those kind of things.
So curious, because if I'm a young person thinking about what it takes to get into kind of the larger entertainment field, what were the skills that you brought to production, like, and how did you get them? If it wasn't, this is a real question, because my all of my event programming experience comes out of being in student leadership in college. I'd
Mm-hmm.
done nothing before that. So are you saying that literally volunteering at PFW gave you most of the skills you needed to be able to put on events?
No, what I'm saying is PFW hooked me up with the people.
The
Yeah,
relationships.
the relationship. So like Karen Spellman, to this day, she's a mentor, but back then she was invaluable. I learned literally the festival was going to be at the Kennedy Center. So I learned how to book talent. I learned how to advance shows. I learned what was required day of show, on the ground, backstage. I learned how to do a run of show. At the time, I also was fortunate in that I had a part-time job before there was the Museum of African American History and Culture. In American history, the American History Museum, there was a small office of African American history and culture, and Niani Kilkenny was my boss there. And again, we would do events through the Smithsonian, and I kept being fortunate enough to be introduced to people and to kind of keep honing those skills. And so I think relationships is invaluable. But I do think if you're a young person and you're interested in something, reach out to someone you see doing it and volunteer. And I think, especially in the time of COVID, it's really hard to volunteer, right? Because everything is virtual, people aren't really in offices. But hopefully, once we get to a point where we can be in person again, if you're interested in a particular thing, find the person doing that thing and said, hey, can I tag along? Can I watch you? Can I help you? Because there are arts management programs, and again, obviously, international business diplomacy was not that. But event coordination, like for instance, when you said you learned mostly in student government, putting on events, right? True event coordination and production is still, in my opinion, a very hands-on kind of thing. It's a skill that is passed on from one generation, a set of skills passed on from one generation to another. It's also a particular temperament and certain characteristics. Like I am very detail oriented, and I can remember numbers, like phone numbers. I can remember figures. I can remember things like this, that help you when you're on the road or when you're producing event. Is I'm sure when you can, when you have that kind of recall, you're like, no, I don't know.
I got a phone for that.
Well, I'm older than you, Mazi. So, look, I got a phone for it too, only because now I got COVID brain and I am older. So I got to write more things down. But as you know, you really need to be detail oriented if you're going to do production, like cross every T, dot every I. And you also have to be flexible, because rest assured, whether it's on the day of the show or the day the festival starts or artists are flying, something's going to happen that you're going to have to help them to recover from, or you're going to have to recover from, and think quickly on your feet, And I take those skills to PFW too.
Just out of curiosity, because I'm literally learning everything you're telling me on this interview. Have you or had you thought about a different form of art other than music? Had you thought about visual arts or thought about dance?
No, I never thought about dance, although I love it. The only visual arts I ever did was actually when we were expecting our daughter, and I really love painting furniture and doing things like that. Decorating furniture, but that's it. I've never thought of visual arts as a career.
No, I meant in terms of event production, like thinking about the kinds of things that you would produce. Same answer.
Well, wait, rephrase that for
because everything you've done, it sounds like most of the event production work you've done has been around music. So I was just curious, had you ever thought about doing any event production around the visual arts or around dance, as an example? Theater.
So when I was a curator for district curators, our season consisted of music, multimedia arts, dance, theater. We did all of it. So we presented, there was an opera, it was Julius Hemphill, what was it called? Long Tongues, a jazz opera. So that included the visual arts, because of course you have set design that you have to work with. You have to work with a lighting person. Of course, you have the composer and the ensemble, but you also have to work with dancers. And we did a number of dance pieces actually where I was the producer for them. But in terms of what I think I know best, first of all, let me back up. I think when you do event production, it doesn't matter the language or the medium you're producing. The steps are kind of the same, right? I mean, I think that if you're curating something, it's better that you know that medium if you want to be a good curator. Like if I can curate an awesome music festival. I don't know that much about visual arts. So if I was going to curate a visual festival or a festival of visual arts, I'd probably find someone that knows more about visual arts than I do. Although I know the steps of production, if that makes sense, The same thing with dance. I might find a great choreographer to help me produce that, who knows the dance world in a way that I don't.
So you talked about your mother wouldn't have thought about herself as an activist. I'm curious what role activism plays in your own life or in your own history.
Well, now I think it permeates everything I do. Permeates where I shop. Like, for instance, people say it's silly, maybe, but like I will not shop at Walmart because they do not treat their workers properly. I try not to order, although I do it. And this summer I was incapacitated for 3 months. I broke my ankle and I had another operation. But I try to limit my ordering on Amazon because, again, if someone doesn't treat workers right, I try to live simply, but see, that comes with time too. I realize, like, I'm at an age now where there's nothing else really I need in the world. Everything from here on is like a want. And I'm talking material things now. It's not a need, it's a want. And I think that comes with understanding that our resources, when you're younger, and when I was younger, you think resources are unlimited. I mean, I'm sure the young people here, they already know that. They're clear, because I also think that every generation is more sophisticated and more knowledgeable. They come here that way, right? Than the previous one. So I think the way I live my life is a form of activism, but I also get in the streets. You know, I mean, during the George Floyd uprising, during the, as you know, on PFW, we go to marches and we cover them and we report live from them, broadcast them live. But personally, myself, I go to sit-ins. I was out there in the park in Zuccotti, not Zuccotti Park. That's here in New York. In the park when they tried to bring down the statue in Lafayette Park. I forget which statue that is, but I was there that night. I got tear gas that night. But I feel like there's a beautiful. I can't remember the line exactly, but there's a song that Sweet Honey put to music of a speech Ella Baker gave, who was an activist. And basically, it talks about, like, I'm just here to support the young people doing this work. And so that's also the way I see my activism. It's like if someone wants my advice or if I can be of support, that's one of the reasons I went out to the George Floyd protest for those weeks, because I would go out, I would go live, and I would on Facebook, and I would do that because I wanted to show that these young people who were out there night after night were peaceful. They weren't rioters. They weren't the problem. You know what I mean? They were trying to make a difference. They were trying to make a statement. They were pushing for change. And I tried to instill that in my daughter, my activism. But again, I really have WPFW to thank for that, because when I came to PFW when I was a young woman, I was like 19 years old, right, when I first started as a broadcaster there. And I encountered all these people that blew my mind, that were in all sorts of movements, and I'm really thankful that I had that political education at that age, because in our family we were always resistors. Look, my father played jazz. As I said, my mother did her thing. But my grandmother was at the March on Washington and talked to us about it. My great grandmother talked to me about being a domestic worker and what that was like, and resisting in her own ways. So I just try to live my life like kind of on the shoulders of those people, and remember, particularly for Black and Brown people, that I guess I can call myself an elder now, but even just as a person, that we stand on the shoulders of so many who sacrifice so much. And so I have to continue with that tradition.
How do you feel about kind of the state of artivism, for lack of a better term, this idea of art that inspires change, whether that's personal change or institutional change or community change? How do you feel about the state of current art that's doing that? And if there are specific things you can point to, helpful.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think it's wonderful. I think that, I have a friend. He's a visual artist. His name is Preston Sampson, and he's pretty well known. I mean, his art can be seen in Busboys and other places. But, excuse me, all of his art, and he's, I've known him for 30 years, and his art has always been documenting Black life, and usually around a theme. So whether it's food or music or visual art or whatever it is, or protest. And he's still doing that, and we have a lot of folks like that, right? We have Romare Bearden. We have, I just saw an exhibit, forgive me, it's escaping me now, but there are a lot of visual artists doing that. I think that in terms of, artists now, and I'm sorry, I'm probably not as current as the young people here. So, you know what I mean? Keeping up with, but for instance, and there's different types of artivism. So there's a group in DC called Capital Bop, right? They present a festival, and they presented a festival all about DC music and culture. So that's one way of being an activist and representing a full picture of DC, not gentrified DC, not only the arts, but really fusing this idea of art and activism. Nag Champa is a group that comes out of DC that they definitely try to fuse art and activism in the work that Jamal Gray does. And by the way, his father was a legendary programmer at WPFW. He was always an activist or an artivist, if you will. He had a record label and recorded many Black musicians that others just wouldn't record. And the types of musics too he chose. But but there are other artists that I love. Like I love her, you know. I love some of what she sings about, you know. Um, if we look at like women, right, strong women, and what is it called? My daughter calls it something now, but but breaking away from stereotypes around size, you know, and how women should present themselves and should look and what size they should be. I love I'm sorry, my mind is just, and you all know the art, you will know the artist. I wish my daughter was close by, I could ask her. Uh, she plays violin too.
No, I know who you're talking about. Her name escapes me as well. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay.
Oh my, I can see her, but I just love the way she unapologetically presents as a larger Black woman, and because that, you know, those are that's artivism too, right? When you say we're not going to subject ourselves or to fit into this box that we should fit into as performers. You know, we're not going to look a certain way, we're not going to dress a certain way, we're going to do our thing. But you know, we grew, I mean, you're a little younger, but you know, there's so many though. There's Arrested Development, there's the Fugees, there, you know, I mean, like there were a bunch of artivists in our day. Lizzo, thank you. I love that young woman. She's so unapologetic and bold, you know. And I know people say, well, you know, what they're singing about. I love French Montana, and not the songs are okay, but what I love is, and there are other African artists like this too. If you look at their videos, they're shot in Africa. They often have men dancing, doing African dance, traditional African dance, even to a pop or hip hop beat. That's a form of activism, of artivism, to say we're not going to confine ourselves to your stereotypes of what the images should be that go along with these songs. You know, even as sometimes the words don't match up with the images that we see. So, you know, that I hope I'm sorry, I'm not so, you know, versed, but then, you know, there are other people that I'm sure the young people know about. There's like John Coltrane, you know, there's a Max Roach, there's an Abby Lincoln. All of these people were artivists, if you will. You know, Charlie Parker. People don't think of that, but jazz was a revolutionary music. And honestly, there were a lot of quadrants. Billie Holiday, she sang Strange Fruit and was literally punished for it. You know, even after, I mean, you know, first they said, okay, she's a drug addict. They took away her cabaret card. But a lot of that was because she would not back down. There was a song called Strange Fruit, and I'm only going into this for the young people, who talked about, it was about lynching in the South. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. And this fruit that they bore were often men, but not exclusively men, women, children, hanging from these poplar trees. And she was supposed to sing it at Carnegie Hall and also at Cafe Society, which was an uptown club. When I say uptown, I mean upscale club. And they did not want her to sing that song. It was a protest song written by a Jewish man, Abe Poland. And she was like, no, I'm going to sing it. And so they just harassed her. The FBI harassed her. The New York Police Department harassed her. So, you know, again, I think Black and brown people, we come out of this, our art comes out of this place of struggle, you know. And that's not to say all of it is that, but I think we really, because of our DNA, because of who we are, because of what we've lived through, we can't help but have that seep into what we do.
In retrospect, what do you feel like your 19-year-old self, what are the skills or experiences you brought to PFW that they were able to plug in to get you to be able to be useful, but also learning? And then like we can spend the rest of this time talking about PFW, your own experience there, and then kind of where it is right now in terms of the kinds of programming that are available. And then maybe if there's a vision for if there's going to be anything different going into 2022, 2023, being able to share kind of what you see, if not just the future of PFW, but maybe the future of kind of the programming that's available on the Pacifica Network.
Okay. Oof, that's a big, you got a lot of parts in that question, Mazi. So let
I
me
want to give you a big question because we've got like 17 minutes left.
Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. So my 19-year-old self, I think Imani thought I knew more music than I did. because I was Sonny Stitt's daughter. That's the first thing. I thought she really thought I knew the music. And I didn't. I learned on air, just like some of our programmers learn on air, right? And the funny part was I was a real jazz purist. I was a knucklehead, I will say, when I was younger, because I was like all about Bird, Charlie Parker. I was just all about bebop, maybe hard bop, and that was it. But there was no avant-garde. There was no Sun Ra. There was no defunct, jazz, funk, punk stuff. There was just only straight ahead jazz. So at my young 19 years old, I was very traditional. And so I think she put a whole lot of stock in the fact that I was Sonny Stitt's daughter and I must have known all this stuff that I didn't. But I've always been good at listening. I'm a quick study, so I think that is key, just observing. And I would listen to the shows on PFW too. When I wasn't on the air, I would listen to these other amazing programmers and I would learn music. And then once I found one thing I liked, like even now when I Shazam a lot, right? Because I love all kinds of music. I can be in a restaurant, I can be in the nail salon, wherever I am, I'm Shazamming. And then I'll kind of go down the rabbit's hole with an artist that I find that I like. And then that'll lead me to other artists. So I'm good at research. We skipped this, but for 3 years, I ran the Smithsonian's Jazz Oral History program. And so I would do oral histories and I would record. And Mazi's like, what? How many lives have you? I've had a lot of lives.
You've had a lot of jobs.
a lot of jobs. That's right. But I love research. So I think I brought that to the fore. I brought that with me. I think I'm a pretty personable person. You know what I mean? So that, and I think to be on air, thank you for the time. That means a lot coming from you too. And so y'all don't know, but I always thought Mazi didn't like me until much later. We got to know each other. So I think I'm a fairly good listener. I'm personable. I'm a quick study, and I'm a researcher. And I'm curious. I think the most important thing for anybody, anywhere in the world, is just to be curious about what's out there. And don't let yourself be limited by what people tell you should be into, what people think you should be into. If there's something that sparks your interest, go for it. Look it up, research it. You know what I mean? You'd be surprised what you can find and how far you can go. If you really, that's the other thing I would say, like follow your heart. You got to follow your heart because life is too short. And as I'm sure your parents tell you, as Mazi tells you, and the other instructors at Words, Beats, and Life, that once you're in a career, like really in it, you're going to be in that for a long time. And so if you're in something that you don't love, that you don't feel passionate about, and that's the other thing I would say, I think that when I love something, I have a lot of passion for it, which kind of sustains me and keeps me trying to move forward and interested in doing better at it. So that's that. And with PFW, I think I really came up through the ranks. Like I said, I started as a programmer at 19. There was a strip 10 a.m. until noon called Black, Beige, and Brown Quintet. And it was 5 women, African-American women, who had we would present 5 different takes on jazz or on music in general. And again, I told you I was very straight ahead. So I was playing Sarah Vaughan, I was playing Ella, nothing outside the norm. I played a little bit of Abby Lincoln, but I was playing Charlie Parker. I didn't even play John Coltrane back then or Eric Dolphy because I felt like they were just too far left. So we couldn't do that. But each of us did a different thing. I think I was fortunate back then also, there were a lot of elders at PFW and there were not a lot, but there were enough young people. And it was really intergenerational in that the elders took us under their wing and really schooled us, and they didn't just school us on music. They schooled us on how to conduct ourselves. They schooled us on you talked about other art forms, like on visual arts and dance. They schooled us on politics. But it was always respectful. And they also listened to us with some things. And so I was a programmer and then for a long time. And then I left for 4 or 5 years and I came back as music and cultural affairs coordinator, which is basically partnerships with organizations. So we formed partnerships with the Kennedy Center, with IPS or Words, Beats, and Life, whatever, And then I was interim program director for many years, as you know, for 6 years. And finally, last was 2020 of May of 2020, I think I became permanent program director. And again, I think curating live performance, those same skills have been good for me. And I apply those skills to curating for the radio, you know.
And I think that shows up in kind of innovative programming like Live at 5. But I also wonder, is there a formula for PFW to kind of build these strips? Like, how is it that you've approached what is a mostly volunteer radio station in terms of the on-air programmers to create these strips that still make sense together? Talk to about that formula of basically creating kind of mini communities that are part of a larger community on air.
So, well, so first of all, I don't think, I mean, I didn't go to journalism school. I just want to be clear. So in terms of the things or broadcast, communications, so the things that you might learn there, I did not know. So I really used more of the arts curation formula for me. So for instance, I think about what makes sense coming out of Democracy Now! Like what programs make sense coming out of Democracy Now! What's going to hold the listener's attention coming from a Democracy Now! Going to like a Malveaux, which is Julianne Malveaux, or going to Voices with Vision, which is Netfa Freeman and Craig Hall, very black brown political show. So I think about what makes sense. I know I'll give you another example. On Wednesday afternoons from 1 until 3, we have kind of our North African block. So we have Africa Now with Mazi Mutafa and James Pope, which deals with mostly sub-Saharan Africa, but they are both so good at looking at the diaspora too. But then following them, we have Zain El Amin looking at North Africa and the Middle East, which we know is a geopolitical term, but for the purposes of our conversation, I'll say the Middle East. So it fits together well, On Fridays, we have a kind of indigenous peoples block in that we have at 1 o'clock, we have Latino Media Collective with Oscar Fernandez and Abigail de Roberts. And then following that, we have John Kane. So they look at, South, Latin, Central America. But we know that there are indigenous communities everywhere, but certainly there. And then John Kane brings it back to a North American indigenous community. So, I look at, if that makes sense, I look at what might fit together, because I also think of, if we want to do a special, right, on a particular thing, if it's already there together, then it's much easier for those programmers. If there's a synergy between those programs, it's much easier for those programmers to work together.
Yeah, we have a comment here from a viewer that says, I grew up listening to Elaine Carter and learning from her. Yeah. The excellence in programming has shaped the community so much.
Oh, thank you. I grew up listening to Ellen Carter too. So
that was from Prowess to Testament. She's an amazing MC located here in the DMV area.
Okay.
So as we get ready to wrap up, I feel like one of the things that not only the diversity in programming, but even this idea of taking advantage of the fact that it's volunteer means that very few people could do every single day.
Right.
Creates an opportunity for you to be able to pair people or have them be in the same time block, so that people that are interested in something in one aspect of a thing can learn more than just the part that they're interested in, if they have that kind of time to listen to the radio at that time of day.
Right.
Are there ideas, especially navigating this kind of COVID world, for programming moving into the future? I know I haven't actually told you this, but we just got done renovating what was my old office to be a recording studio, because we want to use Live at 5 here at our office and be able to send it to you.
So
wow! Bring that back, doing the video and the live performance.
Yeah.
So, are there things that you all are thinking and talking about?
Well, we are. So one of the things, since you bring up Live at 5, we're building out our HD channels now. And so one has to be by FCC regulation, a redundant station. So which meaning that everything you hear on our terrestrial air will be on that first channel. Then we're going to have one that's all music. Then we're going to have one that's all talk. And because it's HD, or because we have these other channels now, we can really expand the breadth of what we offer. We can take programming that we can't fit basically on the terrestrial air and put it on the HD channels. One of the things we talked about with Live at 5 is that your segment was impeccable, but there was a qualitative difference in how the show was presented Monday through Friday, right? So we talked about just what you're talking about. Let's record Live at 5 and then put it on the HD channel, and that way we can have it every single day, not just Monday through Friday, but the entire week. But also we can up the quality of the production, in terms of making sure, for instance, it's live bands, right? That they're really EQ'd correctly, that the announcer's voice is not clipped, little things like that make a difference between something that's listenable and enjoyable and something that's a strain and that you're going to tune out on. So these HD channels will really open up things for us. There's a lot of appointment listening that goes on at WPFW, which I think is a wonderful thing. But if you ever miss something that you want to hear, you can always go to our archives, which is on our website. And music programs stay up for 2 weeks, and public affairs stay up for 6 weeks. And the public affairs programs you can actually download. We also, for a long time, we were turning our programs into podcasts. That way, people can listen. And we had a staff member that was doing that left us. So we haven't quite gotten back up to speed with that, but we hopefully will in the near future.
So I want to just drop the website below for folks that aren't currently listening to WPFW. So we've talked about some innovation. So I guess maybe one of my last questions, especially.
I'm sorry. I just want to add this, right? The other thing is, so you talk about the future. I just mentioned this to one of our younger engineers. I do not plan to be there forever, or even close to forever, right? Because I got other things I want to do. I got to stay around a little longer. It's permanent. But, we really want to get younger people in the building learning. Like I was young once in the building, and this is how I learned. And we want to get younger people in the building to learn so that PFW will be here. We've been here since 1977. We know that we can't be here. We're at the age, we're not going to be here much longer, but we need to train people, young people, to be the stewards of PFW, to understand what the mission really is, and the mission of Pacifica is, and to want to uphold that, to have a deep, deep interest in music and liberatory public affairs. You know what I mean? And we don't expect anyone to come fully formed. We want you to come and work with us and learn from us so that we can then leave it to you all, the next generation, to do what you will with it,
So is there a plan in place to try to recruit those young people? Because I know I listen to Howard University student radio station. Mm-hmm. I know that Morgan has a student radio station. So there's all these young people that are on radio for their campus with this kind of low power, or now even in their cases HD. Mm-hmm. Is there thinking about how to get those young people into a PFW pipeline?
There is actually, but we don't want to limit it just to young people who are in university. We want young people in your program. There's another program we work with, Jackie Carter. I can't remember the name of her program. We really want it to be pretty democratic in terms of who gets to participate. But one of the blocks on our HD channel, on both the music and the public affairs, will be like a 4-hour block that is completely produced, soup to nuts. So that's the technical, that's the content, everything, by young people in our community. Some will be university students, others might be high school students, others might be in programs like yours that come together and produce an hour of radio or a half hour, and I think for young people too, we do things in hourly blocks on our terrestrial air. But I think that for young people to be able to learn and train, we can do much more of half-hour things or 15-minute pieces or things like that. So yes, we do want to make space for young people to learn to do what we do, so that eventually they can be the stewards of WPFW.
It's interesting. I had my interview yesterday was with a DJ named DJ Heat, who started her experience in radio at McKinley Tech. Mm-hmm. Before it became so focused on STEM, she said that they actually used to have an audio-visual track where she was learning radio. So even just up the street from us, the Latin American Youth Center used to have a radio broadcast program because they used to have a low terrestrial, what a low frequency,
right, low power.
yes, low power radio station. So there's examples of high school students doing this work. I'm really excited to hear that this is part of what you see as the not even distant future, but the future.
Yeah.
The last question I was going to ask was just about how PFW is thinking about fundraising differently. Like I got an email last week about you all are starting to accept cars and boats and all that good stuff. So thinking about how the economic model for this moving forward, a listener supported, listener focused station, like how you see that model moving forward and really building community in ways that aren't just listening, but actually showing up, because PFW is doing, before COVID, was doing more in-person events,
right.
Concerts, etc.
Right. So I just want to say that we've been doing that donate your boat, car, whatever for decades. And most, yeah, we'll see. But we have a newsletter now. Saptari has been doing a newsletter that actually lets you know that. But that has been for decades, and it's that program is really available to all public radio stations. If you listen to WAMU, you might hear them say the same, and that's something that's used by public stations across the country. Our model of listener supported, or predominantly listener supported, actually is embedded in our bylaws. So it's not that we think that is the only way to raise money. That is actually the way. Member-supported radio was the way that Lou Hill, who was the founder of Pacifica Radio, and the first Pacifica station was in Berkeley or Oakland, California. Really, it sits in Oakland, California. KPFA. That was the first station. It came on the air in 1949, and he felt like he had been a soldier. He had been a conscientious objector, and he felt like community would support media that reflected their values. And he was a pacifist. So at that time, we're talking about pacifism, but we still feel that way, that community. So in our bylaws, it says that we will come to the listeners 4 times a year, blah, blah, blah. And that does 2 things. One is that it makes sure that we are not influenced unduly or ever by the corporatocracy, by a Lockheed Martin, a weapons manufacturer, by a Pfizer pharmaceutical company, by a McDonald's, so that we're not censored in that way. Our programmers are not censored. They can talk about the hard issues on the air, and there's not going to be any executive calling me up saying, hey, we didn't like what you said about weapons today. So you need to pull that, or we're going to pull our funding. So that is one of the reasons we do it this way. However, we have certainly been getting, and I'm very happy to report, more grant money in, which is really important. There's the Public Welfare Foundation in DC. We've been a recipient of numerous grants from them, but we're also looking at the Doris Duke Foundation has a grant, a technical grant for expansion there in New York City. Because I do think that we have to augment that on-air with off-air fundraising always. And there is other off-air fundraising other than going to the corporatocracy. So we're exploring that. And if you have a car or a boat, your parents have a car or a boat, PFW wants it.
No doubt. Well, see, I want to thank you so much for making time for this conversation. I know that the folks that have tuned in and the folks that will see it on the archive, we're going to send out a newsletter next week with all of the discussions to guidance counselors all over the city to share with their students. I really appreciate you sharing kind of the many roads that you've been on to get to the current destination and the roads that are still before you.
Well, I just want to thank you. I've had such a ball today, and anything I can do to help Words Beats in Life, I will do it. And I think your students are remarkable. And I don't know who to shout out, but I love that drawing of me on the flyer. So thank you. That was such a nice surprise.
No doubt. Well, let me go ahead and wrap it. Katia Stitt, thanks so much for joining me. This has been episode number 4 of this year's Alternative Winter Break. Tune in tomorrow. We're going to be talking about social media. Should be interesting. I'm Mazi Mutafa. Why don't we go and wrap up with just a quick commercial, because this is really intended to help us recruit students for the Words Beats in Life Academy. So if you've got a young person in your life, feel free to encourage them to enroll in our after-school program. It's 100% free, and we teach actually more than 20 classes. Here's one of them.
Let's take you on a time jump, virtual Zoom, bringing it back to Theodore's bedroom. These hands are passionately polysyllabic, putting the Jeopardy theme on swings. 10 dons giving predictions, balancing vibes like the sons and daughters of Ipwan. Ear to the underground, flicking off. Peppermint, fresh experiment, let's go. El Premier Elemento, you gotta take your time, press your fingers to the line. Red man, focus your mind. And once you do that, you're at the front of the combine.